All right, welcome back. This is hands-on exercise number 4. We're doing it. We're making our way through it. And for this hands-on exercise, modify the server from the previous exercise. So create a new map, OAuth connections, and the key should be user IDs from the OAuth provider. The values should be user IDs in your own system. And then we're going to have an endpoint, OAuth, your provider, receive. And so in that endpoint, extract just the user ID from the result of your call in the previous exercise. And this will usually require creating a struct and unmarshalling decoding JSON data. Get the local user ID from the OAuth connections map. If there is no value in the map, set the user ID to a random user ID from your user's map. Create a session for your user just like how login does it. Good candidate for pulling out into a separate function. And redirect the user back to this. And then the last thing I'm going to add in here is good luck. So pause this video, go do that. When you're all done, come on back and unpause the video and you will see my solution, our solution right now. Because without Daniel, my solution would take much longer because I'm able to call a friend and get help. So it's actually been, what's today, Wednesday.
So
And
did we
record? We recorded Monday, right?
Yeah.
So we missed yesterday. So I kind of need to do a little bit of a refresh review. So I just want to start out there and kind of remind myself how this entire OAuth thing is working. And when I think about OAuth, I'm going to think, first of all, I'm going to go to GoDoc and I'm going to search for OAuth 2. And I know that that's the package. And so there's golang.org OAuth 2. And then remember, new client was like a little bit of a deceptive, like if you first came this package, and where you really need to start out is like type config. And so if I take a look at type config, I've got a client ID, a client secret, an endpoint, a redirect URL, and then scopes. So the scopes are going to be my permissions that I could ask for and that are allowed to be asked for from whoever's the OAuth provider. Here's my site, superawesome.com, and here's GitHub, Google, Facebook, whoever I'm OAuthing with. So they will have permissions, which I could then ask for from the client. The client ID is going to be the ID when I sign up at that OAuth, Facebook, Google, GitHub, whatever. They will give me an ID that's always unique to my superawesomewebsite.com. And then the client secret is going to be my secret that I'll give to them to verify that this is me. Is that right? And
Yeah.
I kind of bundle that in.
Yep.
And then the endpoint is going to be a GitHub endpoint or Google endpoint. And so these are actually endpoints, if I remember this correctly, because I have to go look, because this is going to be type endpoint, and endpoint is going to have both an auth URL and a token URL. So the way this OAuth 2 process works, and I know that there are several types of OAuth. There's three-legged, there's the potato sack race. No, I just made that one up. But this one is make a request, come over here, it verifies, first create an account, and then code it, and then make the request from my super awesome website to GitHub, Google, Facebook, whatever. And they verify that my client ID and my client secret. And I'm doing it on behalf of one user. And then they send back, they're going to send back an auth URL, right?
So you send the user in their browser to the auth URL.
Oh, that's right. So the user gets sent there. They sign in. They see what permissions I'm asking for. They say okay, and it sends back to me a token URL, and then I get like a token source.
They send back a code to your redirect URL, which is in your config.
Yeah.
So in your config, your config's got the redirect URL, so it goes back to you, and that's got the code, and then your server uses the code and your secret to exchange it for an actual token at the token URL.
Okay, superawesomesite.com. mysite.com. Let's just do my superawesomesite.com. Choose to OAuth. User can choose to OAuth 2. User can choose to OAuth 2. Form with form button. And see, now this is too slow for Daniel. I get yawny when it's like too fast for me, and I'm like, I don't get it. I'm just going to go to sleep. Daniel's like, this is going too slow. I'm going to yawn. And so user gets sent to OAuth 2 website, sign in, grant permissions, right? And then OAuth 2 website sends back to my
So this is so auth2 user endpoint will redirect the user back to redirect URL in your config.
Oh, back to my redirect URL, right?
And it'll add query parameters with the code.
My redirect URL in config 9 in config.
Yep. So
And-
redirect URL also usually has to be set up on their website when you're signing up for the OAuth.
Yeah. Yeah. So to establish OAuth, I'm going to interact with OAuth 2 API at some site offering OAuth 2 connections, and sign up, provide, get client secret and client ID from them, right?
Yep.
Get client secret, bold client ID from them, provide them with redirect URL, right?
Yep.
And so now I'm signed up. Generally speaking, that's it. So the OAuth Web 2 sends back, so they grant permissions. The OAuth 2 website sends back to my redirect URL in config and adds query parameters to the URL. So if we look at our code up to this point, we created the OAuth config, and here's our client ID. When we signed up, they gave us that, and then our client secret, they gave us that. And then we needed to establish our endpoints, and our endpoints are the auth URL and token URL. We're going to come back to those in a moment. And I gave them my redirect URL, and then I just set my scopes. And then when I look at like, okay, hey, you want to log in with Amazon OAuth, first thing we do is we make sure the method's post, because you don't want to have Git, because Git would allow people to drop in an anchor tag, on their site and maybe log somebody out prankster style from an OAuth or something. And then we create a new UUID, and then we have that map. And here in the map, we're saying, hey, if this is your ID, you've got 1 hour to complete this OAuth stuff. Now, if they granted me OAuth permission to transfer files, and this was like a ton of files from their like Google Drive, and there's a ton of files, and it's taking 4 hours, after 3 hours, would they be timed out? Or this is only on my side, right?
This is only on your side, and presumably you use this to determine how long before they redirect back to your site from the OAuth provider.
Okay.
So not necessarily how long the token lasts.
Okay. And then we redirect, and we do the OAuth auth code URL. And so the config auth code URL, I'm just checking this out in the config. We have, I was looking for that over there. Type config.
So
auth code URL, there it is.
Your,
right there.
your mouse is hovering
I'm like,
over
where
before.
is it? Where is it? So auth code URL. And so here, when we redirect, we're dropping in this auth code URL. And what this function does is we're giving it this unique ID. And so we're saying log in with Amazon. Then we're sending them to a website at Amazon. So this is going to go to auth URL.
Yes.
It goes to auth URL, and then it's adding to auth URL some parameters like that UUID that we created.
So yeah, it adds state, it adds the scopes that you're looking for, it adds the client ID.
Adds state, scope, client ID, right? So the client ID is that ID right there.
That's your state. So the client ID is
state.
the client ID is at the top of your config.
Right, okay. And scope is permissions.
Yep.
Okay. And so then this gives me back a string, which is a URL. And that string is with all those query parameters, then we redirect to that. So this has gone now off to Amazon, and then Amazon looks at all this stuff, state, scope, client ID. And so just to kind of continue our notes here, doing a little bit of a review.
Up above.
OAuth sends back to my redirect URL and config and adds query parameters to the URL. And those are state.
So these are, when Amazon sends back to you, they send back state and code.
Okay, wait, let me see the part. Redirect, provide them with redirects, can choose OAuth, sign in, grant permissions.
So users sent to OAuth website. So there's where you're sending to there, and that's where you're sending in those 3 values.
Oh, okay. Our code calls OAuth, auth code URL, auth code URL, which sends over state, scope, and client ID, right?
Yep.
And then user is asked to sign in. User is asked to do this at OAuth 2 website provider, right?
Yep.
And sign in and grant permissions. Then OAuth 2 website redirects back to the redirect URL, and that's in my config file. And
So config's at the top of main.
yeah, config file redirect URL comes back to this endpoint receive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And adds query parameters to the URL. And so not state.
So yeah, they will send back the state.
Okay, they send back state.
Yep. So you can use that to, and then they also send back a code.
State and a code.
Yep.
And the redirect, because we said, hey, give me an auth code, and then they sent back a code, right?
Yep.
Redirected back to us.
Yep,
So,
and the state just matches what you gave them, so you can use that to look up something in your database for like that login attempt. So like in
Okay.
our case, we use that for timeout.
all right. And so again, we're making sure this is post. No, we're at receive.
Yep. So yeah, receive needs to be get because they're just redirecting back to
Yeah.
us.
And so receive, we get state and we get code, and we're just checking that to make sure it's not empty. And so the state is the ID that we sent over. And then the code is the unique code. We get this code from Amazon. And then we check to make sure that this isn't expired. And if it's expired, then we say it's taken too long. And then we get the code that they sent us, and OAuth exchange our code for a token. This uses the client secret also. The token URL is called we get back a token, right? So we'll get back a state and a code, and then here, I'm just following OAuth exchange. Does exchange actually talk to Amazon servers? It
Yes.
looks like it would, and gives us back a token,
Yep.
right? We now call, and this is exchange,
So that's the config exchange function.
right? And that config exchange function is right here.
Yep.
And then that's going to give us back a token. And the exchange one takes in context, the code, and
Optional options. So just like auth code URL also takes in optional options so you can say I need a longer lasting token than usual for something like downloading files or something.
Okay.
But in both cases it's optional and it defaults to the users right here. We can re-ask them for permission if we need to.
all right. So we exchange takes in context, code,
Yep. And it will also send the secret.
secret,
So,
and that's client secret, right?
yep. Yeah, from our config.
And the code is what they sent us in
Yeah.
the context. And then
And so that's so that the token never gets exposed to the browser because the browser only ever saw the code. And so our OAuth provider,
Yeah.
Amazon in this case, can compare that code and that client secret, and it knows that code was created with a certain client ID back in auth code URL. And so it can match that ID to the client secret to know if it should actually give back the token.
okay.